Hi, this is Charlie Mato-Toyela from bluebearflutes.com. Today, just answering a couple of questions that people have. Thought I might help out a little bit. I know most of you are familiar with our website, bluebearflutes.com. We sell and make all kinds of Native American flutes, including clay whistles and death whistles and skull whistles and drone and Aztec drone flutes, which are the drones that have their own harmonies that play 3 fingers on each side. We make so many different kinds of flutes. And we have a lot of videos here that teach people how to make flutes and different aspects of flute making. You could do this if you do that, or do this, or if you have a problem with your flute this way, you can change it this way. Well, a lot of people ask questions, and we like to answer them usually through YouTube. However, sometimes we like to make a video and answer them through YouTube that way. Okay, so first question, and it comes from Mr. PIE3 on flute track specifics. I made my flute, but I get no sound. And the continuation, am I supposed to angle the track down slightly on both sides, meaning of course where it comes out of the air sound hole and then back into the flute, or is it supposed to be completely flat? Well, that's a very excellent question. And I have some techniques that I use, and I can show you, I think probably on this big boy here. Typically, what I do is, well, let's start at the beginning. Back in the old days, I used to always make it flat, always, no variations. Making it flat got me guaranteed results. However, these days, I've learned how to second guess some of those guaranteed results. And I can show you some techniques that I do that are a huge help. And I don't have my fancy dancy pointer, so if, let's see, if you can find me anything at all to point with, that would be great. Oh, we have a pointer. Thank you so much, camera person. Anyway, so the way that I make my tracks and my sound area today, I'm going to hold this against my shirt so I have something solid while you zoom in on it here. It is always best to have more air space coming out than going in to the flute. This part right here, I like to curve down into the flute. This is coming out of the air supply hole. So you blow in the mouthpiece, it comes out of the air supply hole. I like to have it curved down into the air supply hole, creating the least resistance possible and giving it the potential for the most air possible. So that's what I do right there. Every single time. Been doing it for a couple of years like that now, pretty regularly and with great results. And I say a couple of years, I mean we're talking about thousands of flutes that we've made like that. So next, should it curve down into this part? It should definitely not curve down into it like it does in the back. Once again, this is my own technique. You may find that making it completely flat across works best for you. However, once again, thousands of flutes this month or week. Anyway, we find that this here works best. Now, there is a little slight variation on that. I take a jeweler's file on every single flute, and I very carefully and very lightly taper this down. So right here at this exit point where the air comes out of the air supply hole, goes across the track and comes out and wants to pierce the edge of this sound hole here, I like to file it down just ever so slightly with a jeweler's file. So that's basically it. Very good question. I will tell you, back in the old days, or at least I've seen lots of schematics from the old days that represent it, some people file this area here downward and upward. Now, we only file it upward most of the time, but I have experimented a little bit with filing it downward at times too. That is on the sound edge itself, on the actual edge of wood that vibrates. And I noticed that slanting it down like they did in the old days sometimes produces a really excellent result that we very much like. However, you know, I like to make it as convenient as possible, and likewise, the way we do it today is definitely the way. I'm not going to stick this leather in my mouth. So anyway, we like to do it that way today because we get the same results all the time. But like I said, back in the old days when I first started, I used to always make them flat across. Excellent question, and I hope, Mr. Pi 3, that answers it for you. Next one is from Michael Fox 73. which, let's see here, it's on the video, excuse me, that last one was on flute track specifics, I think I said that, but this one is on how to retune a flute. That's the video in question. It says, hey there Charlie, I have a question somewhat related to the topic discussed here in your video. Is it easier to retune a flute to 432 hertz or to 440, or is it easier the other way around? So I guess basically what he's asking is it easier to take a flute that is currently 432 hertz and tune it up to 440, or is it easier to take one that is 440 and tune it down to 432? And then he continues on, let's see here, boring a hole bigger would seem easier, I would think. I have a couple of flutes that are not tuned 440 and would like them to be, which is why I'm asking. Very good question. And you know, as we go along and make these videos, I find that there are more topics that we need to cover while we're making a video, so we try to cover more of them in line. And likewise, we have a really good video coming up here on 440, 432, and 528 hertz C tuning very soon that I know you guys are all going to enjoy. It should actually be available next day or two from the time this video is made. Gosh, I'm always putting a date on these things. So having said that, you're absolutely correct, Michael, that tuning it up to 440 from a flute that's already 432 is easier than tuning it down from 440 to 432 hertz. 432 hertz is flat from 440. To make a flute flatter, you have to usually, I mean, technically and typically, you have to extend the length of the flute. Now, one thing you can do to kind of cheat there is you can put a plug in the bottom of the flute. This makes it go flatter because you're restricting the airflow, which is basically what you're doing by extending the tube off here. However, having said that, there is a way that you can go in and make it a little flatter with the block. You can actually make the block slanted like this. You see how we have just a slight slant on the block right there? And if you make the slant much more, it actually pushes more of the air into the flute, let's see, with less effort, I guess is the way to say it. Directing the air into the flute with less effort causes the flute to be flatter. For this reason, and gosh, this would be a great video to make too. For this reason, and I don't have my silver flute out here because we only have Native American flutes on this shelf, but a silver transverse flute that you guys are familiar with that are played in orchestra and they're played here and there. They're played in a lot of old Western movies too in the background for Native American flute music. This is the reason that a lot of people believe that Native American flutes should be low-toned, because what you have heard in the Westerns is usually a transversely played flute. Sometimes it's a pan flute for the most part, and I've heard of even one video that it was a kinna, but for the most part, the flutes that are played are transversely played silver flutes. Now, when you make a transversely played flute, because the air has to spin around in circles, it travels a further path than it does on our flutes, which makes it a little bit lower toned. Not too much, just a smidgen. Makes it respond differently, I guess I should say. However, a silver flute is made out of a non-porous material, which is metal. And if we made a Native American flute out of metal that was to be the same tone as this one, and it were played sideways, you wouldn't have to make it as large as this one here, because the pores inside of the wood, regardless of who made it, whether it's lacquered inside or not lacquered inside, which is an idea some flute makers came up with a couple of 10, 20 years ago. Some people dip their flutes, and I'm not putting y'all down. I mean, more power to you. That's a great way to seal a flute inside and out, and I'm all for it for y'all. For me, we quit using unnatural finishes a while back, and we're not going back. So we use only natural finishes. Makes the wood look like a natural piece of wood. Getting off on a tangent. So anyway, because the inside of this flute is porous, because the sound edge is porous, because of the amount of air that we travel across it, it makes this flute the tone it is. And if we were to make it like a silver transverse flute, we could make it a little smaller without that because of the pores. So, having said that, the speed with which the air travels into the flute makes a big difference on the way it plays. There are ways we can manipulate that by changing the shape of the block, which may make it go this much flatter. I've flattened things maybe to 1.5 steps one time. Not a good idea, but it's a possibility. So having said that, if you had a flute that is 432, all we're going to have to do is shave off like maybe a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch of material off the bottom of it, and it'll be just about perfectly in 440. And then we have to go back and check the fingerings to make sure they're all the same. So it is possible to take a 432 hertz flute and turn it into 440 much easier than it would be going the other direction. Going the other way, we need to put a plug in it, extend the length of the flute, or make it out of metal. Anyway, good question, Michael. Thank you so much, and I hope that answered it for you. And if you have questions about flute making, you can always email us at bluebear@bluebearflutes.com and ask questions about tuning. And yes, we do offer currently tuning and retuning of other people's flutes. Next question is from Scott B. You can find him on the How to Tune a Flute video here. He's asking a question: could you expand on what kinds of issues arise when the distance between the cutting edge and the fingering holes equal or less to than the distance from the foot to the fingering holes? And we have gone over this question, Jessie and I, my wife, with regards to this particular question, so that we both, are following along with what exactly is going on. I want to give you some examples. Here is a high C flute. It's a high C. On the piano it would be like a C6, I believe. On the flute scale it's a C5. And if you notice, the distance from here to there is almost exactly the same as it is from here to there. That causes this flute, and I'll play it for you, to do some certain things. It's a lot more obvious in lower tone flutes because of the size of the vibrations. So you've got to think about a number of things here. It's a very good question and a very scientific, response I'm going to have to give to you. It's all scientific. Yeah, she's laughing back there. She is. Anyway, so the size of the vibrations inside of the flute on a high-pitched flute are really close together. So they're vibrating really close together and traveling out the flute. On a larger flute, they travel further apart. And this is because the inside of the flute is larger, and it allows the vibrations to travel further before they have to push inevitably out the bottom of the flute or out of fingering. So on a smaller flute, it is much more forgiving having the bottom as long or even slightly longer than the top. Whereas a larger flute is not as forgiving. And I'm going to give you some examples. I know you're thinking back there at your desk, what are you talking about? So, for example, this is a G flute. If we were to have made this G flute with a slightly different hole pattern, and the inside diameter was smaller, but the flute was longer, it'd still produce a G. That would change the location of these holes. It would actually make the bottom of the flute longer, like Scott's question here. It would make the bottom of the flute longer from the fingerings to the bottom than it would be from the top. What this does is it causes a few things to happen. Number one, the size of the holes may be thrown off just a little bit. Size of fingerings is very important. I mean, none of this stuff is set in stone. I don't know how many times I have to tell you, it ain't rocket science. No, it's not. However, the flutes that we make today are based on patterns that we have experimented with over the last 30 years that seem to work the best for their particular tone. Most of our G and F sharp flutes are 7/8 of an inch in diameter inside, which will cause them almost every time to be inevitably between this long and that long. I'll whack myself in the face. From this long to that long. Because of that, it produces a tone in a certain level of clarity. If you were to make the inside of the flute, which many people do, 3/4 of an inch and make it a G or an F sharp, that was this long instead, it would actually produce a G or F sharp tone, but it would be very likely to overblow. And overblowing is whenever it jumps from the bottom octave to the top octave of that particular note or something in between. So it causes that to happen. It also causes the fingerings to overblow, which causes some back pressure issues up in here as well, that makes the flute play a certain way. And going back to Mr. Let's see here, Pi 3's question about track up and down, throws a lot of that stuff way out of whack. So the rules change basically of physics when you get to that level. Now, having said this, and gosh, I'm just going to reflect back over everybody's questions so far. I do have a PVC flute that a good friend made. One of the best sounding PVC flutes I've ever played. The reason I have it, because it's just a miracle. I mean, it's magical for a PVC flute to sound as good as this one does. And he got really good at it. No, I'm not going to give you his name. I'm just playing. Anyway, the PVC flute is a non-porous material, or it has smaller pores, very fine compared to wood. And it is made on a 3/4 inch inside diameter base, and it plays great, and it's an F sharp. So it has to do with the speed the air is coming out and the distance the air has to travel and the size of the vibrations as they travel through the flute, whether they're 7/8 of an inch wide, or if they're 1 inch wide, or if they're only 3/4 wide. So all of that, you know, there certainly is a scientific explanation for it, and we could get into that, but that's not going to make a good flute. Science doesn't make good flutes. I'm sorry, it just doesn't happen. I've had countless people say, well, I followed all the information from this calculator that I found online, and it does this, that, and the other. It doesn't know a whole lot. The calculator knows options, not plausible causes. So yes, you can make an A flute that is 1 inch in diameter bore. Many people do it thinking they're going to make a low tone flute because they made the bore so large, but they didn't change the location of the fingerings or the length of the flute, which it all goes together. So some vibrations tend to want to expand to only a certain size. Anyway, so long story short, again, I guess it's just a long story one way or the other. Here's a flute that is a fine example of a very low tone flute. This is the D we were talking about just a moment ago. The distance from here to here is quite a bit different than it is from here to there. And this one's open on the inside. I got a plug in it. So it's a true distance of the flute. And it's shorter down here. And that's because the inside diameter of this jobby is 1 inch. And because of that, it makes the flute perform the best, in my opinion, to the way, and I didn't play it for you earlier, I guess I should have, to the way that I think flutes should sound. So, once again, in my opinion, it is always best to make the flutes based on a pattern that the distance from the bottom fingering to the bottom of the flute is shorter than it is from the top fingering to the top of the flute or sound edge. The sound edge in the flute is the top of the flute, regardless of the mouthpiece. That's where the flute begins. And likewise, that is what it's going to be to make a good sounding flute, in my opinion. Good question, Scott. Last question, finally. I know you guys are thinking, gosh, I can't believe I spent all this time. What time is it already? From Tom C., who's a regular. I think most of these guys may be regular, but Tom I recognize. We've communicated a lot. Video is simple ways to prepare Native American flute making cane for storage. And he starts off, g'day, Charlie. Does the wax, did I pronounce that right? Does the wax and oil affect shellac in the same way as other lacquers? Tom, very good question. So what the wax and oil does to a flute, or does to a material, is it soaks into the pores, if there are pores, large enough for it to soak into. Sometimes, I don't know if any of you have ever tried the experiment of having a glass of water and pouring rubbing alcohol into it and watching whether the level of liquid raises or not. If you haven't tried it, it's a waste of rubbing alcohol, but if you can get it for like 30 cents, you know, I mean, it's a great experiment. It's very interesting scientifically to get a glass of water, draw a little line with a marker on the glass where the water level's at, and pour rubbing alcohol into it. The rubbing alcohol does not significantly make the water level raise very quickly. And the reason I'm telling you this is because of the size and shape of the molecules of the water, excuse me, versus the size and shape of the molecules of the rubbing alcohol. The two of them intermix together on the molecular level in such a way that they don't take up more space when you add them together. So, does this mean you've been paying too much for rubbing alcohol? Most of it's mixed with water. Anyway, so what I'm trying to bring across here is that basically all matter has a specific size and shape, and let's call it a pore for just matter of sake of argument here. The pores are a certain size and shape, and certain molecules like oil, for example, will fit into the molecule sizes of the pores of the material. The pores of wood are quite large in comparison to the pores of lacquer. Lacquer has a smaller pore after it's poured, after it's brushed on or however it's put on there. And likewise, oil is getting really close to the size of a lacquer molecule's pore, or lacquer, I guess, compound's pore. And the oil can eventually soak into the pores of the lacquer, whether it be shellac or otherwise. And even oil-based lacquer, I think I mentioned in the video that you can coat a flute in oil-based lacquer and then come back and wipe it down with oil and not see very much of a change. It will change over time, over the process of maybe 5 or 10 years of doing that, of wiping it down every couple of months. You may find that the lacquer is completely gone. You may not have even noticed it go because, once again, we're dealing with oil-based lacquer, which is already made out of an oil-type material. Part of the reason it takes longer to dry, too, by the way, and part of the reason that it seals, that it sets really well if you get it wet. Like Gorilla Glue, for example, is a expansive foam, and it says to make it seal, to wet it. And the reason this works is the molecules of the expanding foam don't find anything else to adhere to, because the water is, its molecules so large in comparison to the size of the molecule or the pore of the expanding glue, that it quits, doing everything because there's nothing else for it to do. It starts working on its own setting procedures rather than dealing with oxygen and the changes that it has there. A lot of your oil-based lacquer says to set it with water. So if you paint your house in oil-based lacquer, some of the instructions may say to go back and wash it with a water hose, and it'll dry faster, which is true. Because as the water's wicking off and drying too, it also causes evaporation. Lots of stuff happens. Anyway, the shellac has large pores, to my understanding, when it's finished, and, well, in comparison to other materials, and it will soak up oil just like anything else will. If you've noticed, though, wood soaks up oil very quickly because it has large pores, and things that don't soak it up very quickly have smaller pores. So anyway, so putting the oil on shellac will probably eventually cause the shellac to come off too. The way that oil removes shellac and water-based lacquers is more violent and quickly and abrupt than it is the way it removes oil-based lacquer. Oil-based lacquer just kind of eventually wears off. With water and shellac, though, in my experience, oiling that type of material causes it to crack, or sometimes create some, not really bubbles, but some air pockets start releasing some of their material, and you'll get pits and what have you, and eventually it'll just all fall off. That's over time, over a long period of oiling a lacquer or shellacked flute. However, in my opinion, using oil and wax on it is the much better procedure rather than shellacking or lacquering it. And don't worry about it if you've already put it on there for, say for sake of just cleaning it down, because that's all that your furniture polishes are. Basically, they're paste waxes, and they don't soak into the material continually like something that's more viscous does. So, a paste wax on a furniture that has a lacquer finish is eventually going to remove its finish too, but it does it very slowly because you wipe it on and wipe it off, and it just kind of seals the pores and almost like melds them together like PVC cement melds stuff together. So, good bunch of questions. Thank you again, Tom C., for your question, and I hope this has answered all of your questions that you guys have had, and gals. There's lots of flute making gals out there. Don't want to make you think that I'm discriminating flute making people, but we appreciate all of your questions, and I hope that you have enjoyed our videos. We try to make new ones all the time that fit the needs and questions that people have, and we have some really neat ones coming up. So once again, you can contact us, bluebearflutes.com, by going to our website. You can email us, bluebear@bluebearflutes.com. You can go to our Facebook page, which is Blue Bear Flutes, and probably find us under Blue Bear Arts. If you Google Charlie Mato-Toyela or Flutes or whatever, Blue Bear Flutes, you'll find us. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you so much, and come and see us again very soon. Happy flute making. Y'all take care.